Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The morning begins, as it always does in London, with a low breath of fog curling around rooftops. Rain hasn't fallen yet, but it hangs in the air like an unspoken thought. The stones along the Thames glisten from the memory of last night's drizzle, and beneath them, the river pulses not loudly, not wildly, but like a patient metronome, always in motion, always coming and going. London was never far from water. It began because of it, grew because of it, survived because it stayed close to it. But what happens when the thing that built you begins to ask for something back? The Thames does not shout. It doesn't need to. Its voice is centuries old. It speaks in rise and fall, in silence and swell. And today, it is still rising. This river is not just water. It is a map of time. I've seen Roman boots step into its mud, seen plague ships float toward the city, watched tea and silk drift in from distant coasts. It has reflected firelight and floodlight, held the silhouettes of cathedrals and cranes. It has known centuries of industry, war, royalty, and rebuilding. And beneath all of that, beneath the layers of brick and embankment, beneath the stone, lions and wharfs and bridges, there is still just a river. Still the same pull of moon and tide. Still the same pressure asking for space. Still the same patient flow, just a little closer to the edge than before. At first glance, London appears strong. Its skyline is a declaration of confidence. Glass towers, Gothic spires, domes that catch the morning sun. But lower your eyes. Follow the curve of the river. Look beneath the bridges, Battersea, Waterloo, Tower End. Watch how the water moves. Not just where it flows, but where it lingers. How high it kisses the concrete now. How long it stays, even after the tide has turned. This isn't panic. This isn't disaster. Not yet. This is something quieter, more subtle, kind of memory, returning, kind of boundary, beginning to blur. You can still walk the South Bank and feel safe. Joggers pass by with headphones. Tourists sip coffee and take photos of the skyline. The London eye turns slowly, like the face of a giant watch that forgot what time it was. Everything seems normal. And that's the dangerous part, because this isn't a flood that comes like thunder. This isn't water that smashes windows and carries cars. This is a tide that rises by inches. A street that puddles a little deeper each spring. A tunnel that closes more often than it used to. A staircase that takes longer to dry. The river does not knock at the front door. It comes in through the cracks. It waits in the corners. It memorizes the weaknesses. And London, for all its resilience, has cracks to old infrastructure, sinking land, systems built for a past that no longer fits the present. Every city tells a story about its own permanence. London, perhaps more than most, but permanence is not the same as safety, especially when you build beside the tide. There are maps of what the future might look like, not maps of roads or railways, but of water, of where it will go if the river rises another meter, 2 meters, 3. These maps paint London in new shades. The Thames widens like a slow breath. Basements vanish. Gardens become marsh. The edges of boroughs fade into wetness. It's not a dystopia, not exactly, but it is a different city. One that lives closer to the water and further from the illusion of control. In Whitehall, a lion sits carved into stone. You've passed it, maybe, without noticing. Most people do. But the lion has a secret. If the water ever reaches its paws, the legend goes, London must be evacuated. It's an old bit of folklore, but in a strange way, It holds truth because the river has markers, not just physical ones, but emotional ones. Moments when it asks for our attention. Moments when the city must choose, adjust, or retreat. The choice doesn't come all at once. It comes in policies, in budgets, Q, in whispered meetings between planners and engineers, Q, in documents that say words like resilience and retrofitting. And while those meetings happen, the river keeps rising, not out of revenge, not with rage, but because that's what rivers do. They rise, and if nothing stands in their way, they keep going. For now, we have barriers, gates that swing shut when the surge comes. We have forecasts and sensors. We have models, simulations, emergency protocols. But the thing about the tide is that it does not respect our certainty. It waits for our assumptions. And then, slowly, deliberately, it begins to challenge them. You might feel this change in strange ways. The subway ride that now pauses more often. The insurance policy that quietly changes its language. The street that floods once a year instead of once a decade. These aren't dramatic signs. They're small ones. Too small to spark panic, but just big enough to be noticed if you're looking. And so, we live beside the river. Still, we build and plan and walk and sleep. We raise children in houses that once stood far from the floodplain. We sip wine at riverside restaurants. We laugh beneath string lights that glow above the water. We live with the tide, but we don't always listen to it. This chapter doesn't end with warning. It ends with awareness, because there is still time. Not much, but some time to prepare. Time to plan differently. Time to remember that even a city as vast and historic as London is still vulnerable when it forgets the nature of the water it lives beside. And so, the Thames continues. It doesn't shout, but it remembers every tide, every storm, every inch of forgotten rise. And when the time comes, it will remind us again, quietly, relentlessly, completely. The river does not need to speak to be heard. It does not leave journals behind or etch warnings into stone. It remembers in the way water always remembers, by moving and shaping and returning to places it's already been. It remembers through erosion, through sediment, through tide marks on cellar walls. And when it's especially thoughtful, it reminds us in silence. With a little more water left behind than yesterday, the Thames has flowed through time in layers, and in those layers, the city has floated, sometimes as a capital, sometimes as a battleground, sometimes as a graveyard, but always as a guest, because the Thames was here before the first brick of London was laid, before Londinium, before the Romans, before the Celts fished from its muddy banks, before any name was spoken into its mist. It ran when the land was forest, when the wolves still padded along its edge and deer stepped into the current without fear of steel or soot. It ran when London was not London, just wildness with a silver ribbon running through it. And the river has kept its course, even as the city forgot what that course meant. Rivers are like veins, and London has long been the heart. But even hearts can forget how fragile they are when the veins change. In the medieval city, the Thames was a lifeline. Not just a path, but a promise. It carried trade. It brought food. It brought people and plagues, goods and gossip. It was how news moved, how diseases arrived. Kings were ferried to coronations and bodies to burial. Its waters once froze in bitter winters, so hard that entire festivals unfolded atop it. Bonfires, dancers, stalls, the so-called frost fairs. The river, for a time, held weight, laughter, music, fire-light, and then it would thaw, and everything would slip away. Even joy cannot rest forever on a river. But the river also remembers darker things. It remembers when ships bound for colonies set sail under the mist. It remembers the chained feet that passed its docks, the cries muffled by water and trade winds. It remembers when waste was poured into it without thought, when the water blackened with rot and stink, so thick and foul that Parliament itself fled during the Great Stink of 1858. People thought the smell was the danger, but it was what lived in the water. They could not see the river held all of it: cholera, corpses, industry. And still it flowed. Still it remembered. Water doesn't keep time the way people do. There are no calendars for rivers, no deadlines, no politics, but there are rhythms: high tide, low tide, spring, flood, summer, shrink, wind ripple, storm swell. The Thames moves in these rhythms, and it notices when the rhythm changes. When high tide comes higher than it should, when it doesn't leave as quickly, when the storm surges stretch longer and reach deeper. The river has no voice, but its rhythm is its language. It's swelling and falling. It's sudden quiet. Sometimes we call it unpredictable, but perhaps it's just trying to remind us of something we forgot. To live beside a river is to live beside a memory that you did not make. The people of London, past and present, live on top of centuries of floodplain, debris, bones, silt. Every building has ancestors buried in mud. Every foundation stands upon something washed down from upstream. A bricklayer in 2025 rests, their weight on stones displaced by a Roman mill, or a Saxon hut, or a Viking longboat, burnt and forgotten. And beneath all of that, water, still moving, still aware, still the river. The river has outlived empires. The Normans came and went. So did the Tudors, the Stuarts, the factories, the warships, the smokestacks, the Blitz. The river watched it all. It held firelight from burning buildings. It mirrored searchlights, scanning for enemy planes. It carried sandbags, swallowed bridges, in times of war and peace, in prosperity and panic. The Thames never paused. It is London's longest witness, and sometimes witnesses see what others do not. Walk beside it on a quiet morning, and you'll feel the weight of what it holds. It may be hidden beneath tour boats and tides, their pigeons and pub lights, but the memory is there. You can see it in the damp bricks that once held dock chains. You can feel it in the hush of early fog, thick as breath over still water. You can sense it in the way the gulls cry, not in joy, not in warning, but in something older than either. There are times the Thames has turned cruel, but not out of malice, just out of certainty. In 1928, the river rose high after heavy snowfall. An incoming tide, a strong wind, and melting ice created a perfect storm. It breached embankments in central London. People awoke to water in their homes. 14 died. Hundreds lost everything, and the river receded. But it did not forget, and neither did the engineers. In the years after, defenses were strengthened, barriers designed, forecasting improved, and yet, each year, the risk grows. Again, because while we remember disasters, the river remembers all the near misses, too. And the river's memory is longer than ours. Today, when it rains hard and the tide is high, you might see the drains backing up. You might see puddles spreading faster than usual. You might wonder if the river is getting restless again. It isn't angry, just attentive, just aware. Its memory lives in inches, not centuries. It's in quiet refusals to shrink as quickly as before. It watches the sky, the sea, the moon. It watches us. People measure rivers by length, depth, discharge, but the Thames has other measurements. It measures by how many lives it has changed, how many goods it has carried, how many times it has risen when asked to wait, how many dreams have crossed its bridges and disappeared, how many nights it has watched the city sleep, and now it's how far it has risen, beyond what the old maps expected, to understand the future of the Thames. We must look at its memory, not just its surface. Beneath the waves, beneath the sediment, are stories written in layers. A drowned village from centuries past, a coin dropped by a lover on the bridge, a wheel from a carriage that never finished its journey, a single boot from a soldier long forgotten. The river keeps them all. It does not sort by value. It does not care what was lost. It only remembers that it happened. And in remembering, it holds the city to account. The Thames does not warn loudly. It does not break without cause, but it watches our choices. Watches how many barriers we build, how much concrete we pour, how often we check the forecasts, how long we think we can hold it back. And sometimes it tests us, not out of cruelty, but out of memory, because it remembers where it used to be. And if we forget, it will remind us, not with rage, but with rise. A few more inches this decade, a few more next, a flood map revised, a railway shut for a day, a neighborhood reconsidered, a tide that does not leave when expected, a whisper that sounds like water lapping at your doorstep. And one day the memory becomes the moment, and the river returns. You do not hear the ocean rising. It has no boots, no drumbeat, no shouting march, no flags or sirens, no sudden headlines that stop the day. Instead, it whispers. It slips upward, the way shadows stretch gradually, quietly, patiently. A little deeper here, a little wider there, tide that stays longer than it used to. A swell that reaches steps it didn't touch before. And the people nearby, they may say, it's just weather, just a wet season, it's just a stronger wind. But the sea is not shouting, it is whispering. And that whisper is getting closer to the ear. To understand why the sea is rising, you have to go far from London. You have to drift up into the cold breath of the poles, where the earth wears its oldest memory in white. There, ancient glaciers sleep, some the size of cities, others as wide as entire countries. Ice as hard as rock, ice that has not melted since human history began. But even the oldest sleepers stir when the world gets too warm. And lately, the planet has been whispering heat. Ice is stubborn. It resists. It clings to the mountains. It hugs the edges of Greenland and Antarctica. It curls its toes into valleys and crevices, but it cannot ignore the sun forever, year by year. The warmth sinks in, not loudly, not immediately, but deep enough that cracks begin to form. Meltwater trickles through the oldest veins of ice. Crystals fracture, slabs calve and tumble into the sea like pieces of forgotten time. And with every piece that breaks, the sea rises just a little, just enough to matter, just enough to be noticed by rivers that once thought they had seen everything. The Thames is not melting, but it is listening. Rivers remember the ocean. They are its children, born upstream and called home again. When the sea rises, the river feels it like a heartbeat pressed against its mouth. It's like a hand on the back of its neck. Tides press harder. The salt water reaches farther. The edges of the river feel softer. And when the ocean lifts itself higher, Thames does not resist. It simply accepts more water, more pressure. More days when the barrier must close. More nights when the rain cannot drain away. Thus the sea is already too high. Sea level rise is not just about melting ice. It is about warmth. Warm water expands. That is physics. The ocean today is not just deeper because of glaciers. It is wider because of heat. It is a great bowl swelling gently outward, as if someone were filling it slowly from beneath. The warmth of the atmosphere seeps into the waves, and the water lifts itself. Not as a wave, not as a storm, but as a mood. A new default. The floor has risen. And most people haven't noticed they're standing on tiptoe. Some places feel at first island nations where the salt licks doorways. low-lying deltas where crops can no longer grow, beaches that now belong to the tide half the day. But even cities with old stone embankment, cities with memory are not safe. London was not built for the sea of the future. It was built for the tides of the past. Somewhere in a data center, numbers flicker. There are models, projections, curves drawn on graphs. Sea level rise by 2050, by 2100, by worst case scenario, by best case hope. But the river does not read spreadsheets. It listens to the sky. It counts the storms. It remembers the years when the tides stayed too long, senses the slow swelling at its mouth, where the Thames meets the sea and forgets which it is. And it does not wait for consensus. What does 3 millimeters of sea level rise mean? To some, it's nothing. The thickness of a coin. The space beneath a fingernail. Barely a thought, but added to every tide, to every storm, to every inch of sinking land beneath a heavy city. And the difference begins to whisper louder. A strain that once flowed now gurgles back. A tunnel needs pumping more often. A riverbank collapses in a garden that never used to flood. 3 millimeters is not a flood, but it is a reminder, a forward echo of something larger. By mid-century, London's tides may rise as much as 30 centimeters, cast enough to flood hundreds of basements, enough to overtop aging defenses, cast enough to change the rules of where people build and where they leave. It may not happen in a single day, but it will happen all the same. And as the water whispers upward, the earth doesn't stop at the sea. The weather listens. To dot a warmer world means more evaporation, more clouds, more moisture trapped in the air. And when that air cools, it lets go fast. Rains become heavier, storms become louder, rivers become faster. The Thames, already burdened by tides pushing in, is also tested from above. Water from the sky, water from the sea, water from the land, all meeting in the middle, where the city once thought it had control. People ask, will London flood? The answer is not simple, because flooding is not always the kind you see on the news. Flooding can come as a repeated nuisance, a basement that smells of mold, park that closes every winter, a street that puddles for days, where once it dried by noon. Flooding can be emotional, a neighborhood labeled at risk, a house no longer insurable, a child who learns, young, that their home might not last forever, and when the water finally does surge. When a spring tide meets a storm and a barrier fails, then the city will remember that the whisper was always a warning. But the river is not cruel. It does not rise to punish. It rises because the world is changing, because the ice is melting, because the sea expands when it is warm, because we have burned and built and waited, and the river responds, as it always has, not with judgment, just with water. There is still time, time to strengthen defenses. It's time to build wiser, time to listen to the data. To let engineers and artists and elders all have a voice, to understand that sea level rise is not someone else's problem, right? It is not a story from the tropics. It's not a warning for future children only. It is here already, in the wet steps of the embankment, in the warning lights of the barrier, in the pumps that work overtime, in tunnels where no one sees them, in the whisper of the river. At midnight, when the city is asleep, the question is not whether the sea will rise. It already has. The question is how we will change in response. Will we wait for the flood, or will we read the water's quiet poetry, line by rising line? Because the ocean does not knock, it seeps, and if you listen closely, you can hear it just beneath your window, writing its name softly on the edge of your life. A river does not ask for permission. It remembers where it once ran, even if cities forget. It does not knock politely at the door of new construction or obey the outlines on zoning maps. It flows, It swells, changes direction, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, and when the ocean leans forward, just a little, the river takes notice. It doesn't shout or crash at first. Instead, the tide begins to linger longer on the shore. The brackish breath of salt water creeps a little farther upstream. The banks grow darker, not because of the rain, but because the tide now kisses them more often. The river begins to reach, not because it wants to, but because it can. The Thames has always reached for more in Roman times. Its fingers stretched through marsh and lowland. It flooded flat fields with the quiet strength of patience. It carved mud banks and dug deep channels. Traders built wharfs and piers, and the city grew upward and outward from its banks like a vine seeking sunlight. But in all that time, the river never truly changed. The Thames remained what it always had been, a tidal river, a thing of rise and fall, ebb and swell, silence and surge. Humans adapted to its moods. Until the 20th century, Londoners simply accepted that the river would claim its space from time to time. Streets flooded, warehouses braced themselves. Children walked through water in boots that weren't quite tall enough. It was not unusual. It was simply the cost of living beside a river that occasionally wanted more. But now, the Thames is not reaching because of rain alone. It is reaching because the sea behind it is rising. Each high tide nudges more water upstream, and unlike rainfall, tides don't pass through, they push and stay. The old balanced fresh water coming down from inland, so water pushing up from the estuary, begins to shift. The river's boundaries blur. The Thames begins to reclaim territory once thought safe. Not in dramatic floods, not in cinematic catastrophe, but in steady, creeping steps, pavements that stay damp longer, trees that tilt toward the flow, of cracks in the walls of basements, and in old maps. Areas once labeled wetland that are now neighborhoods. The river is reaching for those old places again, and it may not stop. When a river wants more, it does not always show you directly. Instead, it takes its time. First, it changes the soil. Saturated earth no longer supports deep roots. Gardens become spongy. Trees fall during storms, not from wind alone, but because their foundations were weakened by too many damp seasons. Then, it changes the drainage. Old stormwater systems designed for a century ago begin to fail. Water backs up into homes, into streets, into train tunnels. A heavy rain that once ran off in hours now takes days to recede. Next, changes the rhythms. High tides creep a few minutes earlier. Spring tides push a little farther inland. Flood alerts become more frequent. The Thames Barrier closes more often twice a year, becomes 5, then 10, then 30. And finally, the river begins to change your memory of dry ground. A plaza that never flooded suddenly does. A neighborhood that thought itself safe becomes an insurance risk. The line between land and water becomes less certain. The past becomes the present again. The river has reached for more and it has found it. But what does that mean, really? Does it mean for a city when its river slowly takes back the space it once held? It means basements become liabilities. It means metro stations require more maintenance, okay? It means money spent on walls, on pumps, on policies, on hope. It means hesitation about where to build, what to protect, what to abandon. And it means memory of what used to be dry, now wet again, in East London. Near Barking Creek, the river is already testing boundaries. There, the flood defenses are not historical, they are experimental. Earthworks, salt marshes, green infrastructure. The city is trying to learn how to let the river reach without surrendering everything in some places. Land has been sacrificed intentionally. These are called floodplains on purpose. Areas that are meant to flood to give the water space to avoid worse consequences elsewhere. But not all places have that luxury. Some are built too close, too low, too dependent in those areas. When the river reaches, people suffer. It doesn't look like disaster at first. It looks like extra pumps in the underground. It looks like damp walls in a council flat. It looks like higher premiums and lower property values. It looks like inconvenience, not crisis. But that's how the river works. It moves in inches, not miles. It wins by staying. And as the decades pass, those inches add up. London is not New Orleans. It is not Jakarta. It is not an island swallowed by the sea. But it is not immune. The same forces that flood other places, warmer oceans, melting glaciers, storm surges, subsiding land touch London, too. Just more quietly. And the risk here is that the quiet makes people forget that they grow used to the new water lines, that they accept the wet spots, the sandbags, tees, the precautionary evacuations, until one day, river reaches farther than expected, and the city finds itself soaked in its own disbelief. What's strange about the river is that it feels so still. Most days, the Thames is calm, broad, serene. It reflects light more than it churns. It hugs its banks. It doesn't roar or rise like a mountain stream, but the calm is misleading because the river holds more than water. It holds pressure, memory, gravity. It holds the future of the city on its shoulders. And it is growing tired. One day, perhaps, not so far from now, a storm will come. Not a record-breaking one. Not a freak event, just a strong spring tide paired with heavy rain, paired with a surge from the North Sea, and on that day, the river will find itself full on all sides, full from the ocean, full from the sky, full from the drains of the city, trying to pour into it, and with nowhere else to go, the river will go up, not because it wants to, but because it has to. It will reach for more, again. In some versions of the future, the Thames is tamed, barriers hold, its policies adapt, parks are redesigned as sponge zones. The city learns to live with its river rather than against it. But in other versions, the river wins, not by flooding everything, not by washing away history, but by changing the terms of what it means to live near water, by making people choose what to defend, what to let go, what to remember. Because when a river reaches, it does not reach back. It only moves forward. The embankment feels permanent, stone on stone, railings in perfect rhythm, wide paths of pedestrian calm. You walk there without thinking, beside joggers and tourists, cyclists and artists, never once wondering what lies just beneath your feet. But the river knows. The Thames never forgets what it used to touch. Long before the embankment was stoned, before the walls, the floodgates, the elegance, there were marshes here, shifting ground, reeds that whispered in the wind, banks that oozed instead of stood. Beneath the embankment, that memory still breathes. It has not dried. It has not settled. It waits, wet and dark and old, because no matter how many stones you stack, you can't bury water forever. In the mid-19th century, London faced a crisis, not of war, not of fire, but of stench. The river choked with sewage, stick with runoff, and the rot of a million lives became a public threat. The Great Stink of 1858 wasn't metaphor. It was physical. Smells so powerful that Parliament had to hang soaked curtains of lime-soaked cloth just to keep their noses from revolt. And so, the embankment was born, but not just as a walkway or a river wall. It was an engineering solution, disguised beneath the new grandeur of Victoria Embankment. A complex series of tunnels, interceptors, storm sewers were built, a skeleton of brick arteries meant to carry the city's waste far downstream, away from noses, away from eyes, They called it the Bazajid solution, named after the engineer who designed it. A marvel, savior. And in many ways, it worked. The river ran cleaner. The air grew tolerable. And London exhaled. But the secrets were never gone, just hidden under stone. Walk along the embankment today, and you feel only surface. The clink of metal railings, the whisper of water below, the clatter of footsteps echoing off stone. But just below, inches away, the tunnels still run, lined, curved like ribs, still carrying water and waste, still holding back what once surged freely. And above them, heavy stone, roads, benches, trees that were never meant to root, so close to the tide. It all feels so firm, but it rests on soil that remembers marsh, and every time the river rises, those tunnels fill it. The old bricks swell just slightly with moisture. The pressure inside adjusts, sometimes by a whisper, sometimes by a sigh. And though few people notice, the engineers always do. They measure, they monitor, they worry, dash quietly, because they know the embankment was never a wall. It was a compromise. There are places where the embankment leaks, not catastrophically, dampness, tiny seeps along the joints, salt crystals forming like frost where they shouldn't, patches that always need repainting, resealing, reinforcing. Sometimes it's the tide pressing in. Sometimes it's groundwater. Sometimes it's simply time gnawing at the seams like a slow, invisible mouse. In other cities, such signs would mean more. But in London, they are just part of the rhythm, the daily maintenance of pretending permanence. And still, the secrets remain. What else lies beneath? Not just pipes, not just tunnels, but bones and bricks, and barges buried in mud. Archaeologists know that whenever a section of the embankment is disturbed, the past pushes back up through the cracks. Roman coins, medieval shoes, fragments of carved stone from buildings that no longer exist. Even the timbers of Viking ships once docked here before the city forgot. These aren't just artifacts. They are evidence that the river was wider once, that the bank was farther inland, that what we think of as the river was once a much more complicated dance between land and water, and in some ways still is. You may not know this, but the embankment isn't a perfect match. At high tide, water presses against it confidently, but at low tide, the mud flats reveal themselves. It's wide and slick. They stretch out like a memory exposed, and that mud is more than earth. It's a kind of history, a slow-moving archive of what the city has tried to forget. In the mud, you can find clay pipes from the 1700s. You can find bones of animals, long vanished shoes, spoons, shards of pottery from families long gone, and industrial waste, black and oily, a smear from the factories that once used the river as a convenient, forgetful friend. This mud rises and falls twice a day, and in that rhythm, the city's secrets breathe. There's something humbling about knowing that the strongest parts of your city are built on compromises, that beneath the confidence of Victorian design is the soft insistence of tidal mud, that beneath the tourist walkways are old bricks warmed by the heat of sewage and cooled by the chill of rising groundwater, that beneath the roar of taxis are echoes of Roman footsteps, of plague carts, of steamships unloading barrels by lantern light. The embankment holds all of this, not just physically, emotionally. GEOLOGICALLY. It is not just a wall. It is a layered memory of how London learned to live beside its river without ever truly trusting it. Some evenings, when the tide is just right, the water laps at the very top of the wall, kisses the stone in the same spot that a child might rest their hand while looking down at the gentle brown waves. It feels serene, but the river is not passive, It is simply patient. And the embankment, for all its strength, is not invincible, because stone weathers, mortar crumbles, steel rusts in secret, and the water just keeps coming. They say the Thames Barrier can hold back the worst, that the embankment can be reinforced, that the flood risk is under control. But risk is a language we whisper to avoid saying something else, that we built a city on compromise, and we're hoping it holds, that we live beside an old, powerful, quiet force, and we keep asking it to stay in line, that underneath the embankment, beneath the stone and brick and concrete pride, there's still mud, still water, still movement, still a reminder that nothing here is truly solid, not forever, and perhaps not even for now. And for now, you step into the green, and for a moment, the city vanishes. No horns, no towers, just trees, grass, benches, and breeze. Central Park is a pause, hush, a stillness stitched into the chaos of Manhattan. But even here, beneath the soft pathways, beneath the quiet lakes, beneath the runners and dog walkers and carousel tunes, the earth remembers, and what it remembers doesn't sleep. Central Park feels gentle, almost timeless, but it was sculpted, not just planted. Beneath the soil is a web of stone that predates the park, the city, even the idea of America, Manhattan, schist, hard, layered, unforgiving. It lies close to the surface, jutting up in places where children climb and lovers sit with sandwiches. These rocks are not part of the park. The park is part of them. They formed nearly 500 million years ago, in a collision of ancient continents that no one saw but everyone walks on. Beneath your feet are folds of pressure, not just geologic, but human. When Frederick Law, Olmsted, and Calvert Vaux began to park in the 1850s, they didn't just design a garden. They rearranged the landscape. They blasted hills. They filled valleys. They carved roads to look natural, so you wouldn't. No, there were roads, and beneath that artistry are tunnels. Dozens, not secret, but hidden. Service tunnels, maintenance corridors, old sewer lines, even unused subway stubs, paths that never became routes. These underground limbs stretch beneath the calm lawns, quiet as roots, connecting corners of the park that seem untouched. They are rarely spoken of, but they are there, and still deeper, deeper than the rock, deeper than the tunnels. The earth keeps its tension, because even Central Park sits atop fault lines, not gaping chasms, not Hollywood cracks, pressure seams, long forgotten, poorly mapped, but real, and sometimes they whisper in the quietest parts of the park, near the Ramble, beside the North Woods, by the water's edge at dawn. You can feel something else, not fear, not danger, just depth, a sense that the land itself is older than the stories we tell on top of it, and that deep below. Things still shift very slowly, but not silently. Seismologists have placed instruments across the city. Most are on rooftops or basements, listening for tremors too small for skin, but a few, a rare few, listen from within the park. They don't record earthquakes. Not often. They record movement, the micro-movements of rock under strain, the faint rumbles of subway cars miles away, the subtle sway of granite under wind and rain. They hear the city the way a body hears its own heartbeat, quiet, steady, reassuring, until it isn't. The reservoir in the middle of the park, once the city's lifeline, now a tranquil mirror, is bordered by stone that's been reinforced for generations, because water, like rock, remembers its path. And while the reservoir is calm, it's not passive. Water levels shift. Pressure builds in pipes deep beneath the surface. Okay. Engineers check, test, brace, not because of panic, okay, but because of history, because cities forget, but water doesn't. There was once a village here, a real one. Before the park, before the design, before the stone bridges and winding lanes, there was a place called Seneca Village, a free black community, a haven in a divided city. Homes stood here, churches, schools. Then came the plan. The park. The design in Seneca Village was raised, buried first by law, then by landscaping, then by time. Today, a sign stands, a small plaque, gesture, but deep beneath the lawns, beneath the playgrounds and picnic spots. Ground remembers more. Foundations, artifacts, the bones of a community quietly covered by progress, and deeper still, deeper than homes and rock. In tunnels, the bedrock doesn't end. It only grows older. The Manhattan schist dips and folds, and in some places, cracks. Geologists don't map it fully, not under the park, not precisely. It's too costly, too complicated. But they know what lies beneath. A reminder that even a green space, a refuge, a carefully designed illusion of calm, rests on something it cannot control. The fountains bubble, the lakes shimmer, its children laugh under summer. Trees dot, and underground, the earth continues its slow breath. Not loud, not sudden, just pressure, memory, time, sometimes late at night. Maintenance crews descend into the tunnels under the park. They inspect steam lines, electrical cables, drainage, systems. They carry flashlights. They speak in soft voices. They've seen what lies beneath. It isn't terrifying, but it is. It's unsettling because it's not emptiness down there. It's history and rock. And sometimes it's just beyond the flashlight's edge. It feels like the city is listening, not watching, not judging, just listening. And maybe that's what Central Park is. Not just a space, not just a garden, but a membrane, a thin layer between what we imagine the city is and what it really rests on, between our walks and the earth's. Waiting silence. You come here to forget, to exhale, to stroll, to press pause on the velocity of life, and the park allows it. Generously, but beneath the surface, beneath the soil and stone and tree roots, the earth keeps moving. Not fast, not violently, just enough to remind the engineers, the architects, the quiet few who study such things that nothing is still forever. Not even here. The ground beneath New York is different, not softer, not safer, just older, quieter, slower to speak. California is a place of motion, place where the earth stretches, groans, breaks often and openly. It wears its fault lines like scars across the land, visible, named, anticipated. But New York keeps its faults to itself. The danger here doesn't scream, it hums. Out west, the San Andreas Fault is a household name. People talk about the big one. They anchor their shelves. They run drills. They carry preparedness kits in their cars. It's not paranoia, it's memory. Because California remembers quakes in the body, not just in books. The land shifts often enough to become part of daily life. A tremble in a meeting, a jolt during breakfast, the rattle of a passing truck. But it isn't a truck, it's just a planet. Stretching. New York, by contrast, sits on a different kind of edge. Not the edge of a tectonic plate, but the edge of forgetfulness. The faults here are smaller, buried, poorly mapped. They don't move often, but when they do, they surprise. And in a city built on routine, on schedules, on noise and rhythm and steel, surprise is dangerous. People here don't talk about earthquakes. Why would they? There are other risks. Flooding, snowstorms, hurricanes, that ride up the coast like whispered threats. But earthquakes, that's California's problem. That's how the story goes. And yet, beneath the granite and asphalt, the old rocks disagree. The geology of the two coasts is like two different languages. California's crust is young, thin, cracked from motion, new. York's crust is ancient, thick, hard as memory. But old rock does not mean safe. Rock, it means brittle. It means less forgiving when pressure builds. Like glass stretched too far, it does not bend, it breaks, quietly, completely. The last major earthquake to strike California was felt across the world in headlines. It bent highways, crushed buildings, claimed lives. The footage replayed for weeks. But the last notable quake in New York, you'd be forgiven for not remembering it, because the ground here waits so long between movements that we forget it moves at all. In 1884, New York felt the earth shift, not violently, not destructively, but enough to shake buildings, crack plaster, jolt the city awake for a moment. Then it passed, and the city returned to sleep. No one died, but the memory faded, and with it, caution. California builds with earthquakes in mind. It codes resilience into architecture. It embeds shock absorbers into skyscrapers. It trains people to duck and cover before they understand algebra. It, lives and awareness, New York, builds upward, boldly, tightly, but not always flexibly. Some buildings here were raised long before seismic codes became standard. Some still stand on foundations poured in a time when earthquakes were myths, not models. Ask someone in San Francisco if they felt an earthquake, and they'll nod. They'll tell you which year, which time of day, which shelf the glass fell from. Ask someone in Manhattan, and they'll likely shrug, or laughed, or say, not here. But the earth does not follow belief, only pressure. Fault lines do not need fame to exist. The Ramapo Fault, a quiet seam that stretches beneath parts of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, is not a household name. It doesn't trend, it doesn't tremble often, but it's real, and it holds its breath beneath millions of lives. Seismic hazard maps place New York in the moderate risk zone, not red, not calm, somewhere in the middle. But moderate doesn't mean meaningless. It means possible, rare, and if it happens, it's potentially devastating, because unpreparedness magnifies damage in ways the earth never intended. When California shakes, it knows what to do. The buildings move with the waves. The systems respond. The people, trained by childhood drills, know how to brace, how to breathe, how to wait. When New York shakes, the city pauses, not out of protocol, but confusion. Was that? Did you feel? Must have been the subway. But it wasn't. It was the rock, the pressure, the quiet fault line testing its memory. And that's the difference. California expects the worst and plans accordingly. New York expects nothing and plans for everything but the ground itself. It's not negligence, it's habit. The habit of thinking solidity is permanent. That stone is silence. That movement only happens elsewhere, but the rock beneath this city, this ancient, folded schist holds more than subways and skyscrapers. It holds tension. It holds time, and while it hasn't broken in living memory, memory is not a promise. It's just a pause. Why isn't New York like California? Because it forgets. It forgets the small quakes. The old ones. The ones buried in newsprint or whispered by geologists in academic corners. And forgetting is its most dangerous fault line. Even within the community of earthquake scientists, there's quiet debate. How likely is a major quake here? Some say slim, some say overdue, but most agree preparedness is not proportional to probability. It's proportional to consequence. And in a city so vertical, so dense, so old in places, and new in others, consequences ripple fast. Maybe new. York isn't California, but that doesn't make it immune. It makes it vulnerable in a different way. Vulnerable to surprise, to disbelief. It's the slow fade of memory that happens between tremors. And so, the city keeps building, keeps rushing, keeps moving, above ground, above memory, above a stone that's still holding its breath. Some faults make headlines. They are photographed from helicopters, named in documentaries, etched into textbooks with bold red lines. Children learn their contours in school. Journalists quote them. Movies dramatize them. The San Andreas, the Hayward, the North Anatolian. Fault lines that strut across the earth like old wounds. It's loud and unashamed. But most faults are not like that. Most are quieter, older, unlabeled, still holding secrets under cities that never ask beneath your feet. The earth is not solid, not truly. It's not forever. It is layered, fragmented. It's broken into plates like a jigsaw puzzle without edges. And where those pieces meet, they don't sit still. They rub. They resist. They remember. And when the pressure grows, they shift. But not all these boundaries are loud. Some are buried beneath rivers, beneath farmland, beneath forests that have never known disaster. Some are hidden beneath cities. The Ramapo Fault is one such fracture. It does not draw crowds. It doesn't trend. But it runs quietly for over 185 miles from southeastern New York through northern New Jersey into Pennsylvania. It is old, hundreds of millions of years old, born during the assembly and breakup of ancient continents in a time before mammals, before flowers, before the Atlantic Ocean even existed. It was not made for this century. It simply survives within it. To most people living above it, the Ramapo Fault is just a name. If they've heard of it at all, it hasn't caused a catastrophic quake in modern memory. It hasn't flattened cities or sparked nationwide reforms. It has, however, stirred in 1783. Quake estimated around magnitude 5.3 shook New Jersey. In 1884, another tremor rattled the New York metropolitan area. Bricks fell, windows cracked. People ran into the streets in their NIGHTCLOTHES. But time passed, and memory, as it often does in cities, grew shallow. Faults like Ramapo are not dangerous because they are frequent. They are dangerous because they are forgotten. They lie under infrastructure not designed with earthquakes in mind. They sleep beneath buildings that were never taught to sway. They wait beneath populations who don't expect the ground to speak. And when they whisper, just once, just enough, the effect can be disproportionate. A famous fault is like a known storm. You watch it, you plan for it, you measure its moods, but an unnamed fault, a crack buried in geological archives, a fracture without media attention, that's where the real vulnerability lies, because what isn't remembered is rarely prepared. 4 geologists have mapped thousands of these lesser-known faults, some only a few miles long, some massive but quiet, some that haven't moved in recorded history but could. And the strange thing is this: size isn't everything. Some of the most catastrophic earthquakes in history have come from faults. No. One thought to watch. In 1811 and 1812, a series of quakes struck near New Madrid, Missouri, a place that, until then, was considered geologically unremarkable. The quakes were so powerful they rang church bells in Boston. They caused the Mississippi River to flow backward for hours. They reshaped the land itself permanently. And the fault responsible, not famous, not even named at the time, just present and waiting. That's the uneasy truth. A fault doesn't need to be known to be real. It doesn't need to be mapped to cause a shift. The earth doesn't follow human attention. It follows stress and silence and time. There are faults beneath many American cities: Chicago, Memphis, Charleston, even Washington, D.C. Most have never seen a major quake in recent memory. But memory is not the same as immunity. Every crack is a story of past trauma, of crust torn, of movement paused. And like all trauma, it can resurface. Modern technology helps. We have seismic sensors now, scattered across the country, listening to the faintest murmurs, microquakes, tremors, too small for skin to feel, but not too small for machines to record. They tell a story of tension, of subtle movement, of potential, but they don't tell us when and they don't tell us where the next break will happen, only that it can. In places like California, buildings are required to flex. Bridges are engineered to wobble rather than snap. Codes are revised after every major quake. But in places built on forgotten faults, construction tells a different story. Masonry that cannot bend, foundations that rest on assumption, communities that have never practiced what to do when the floor moves. The irony is this: the lack of fame is part of the risk. If a fault were better known, it might be better studied. If it were better studied, it might be better prepared for. But instead, it lingers in obscurity. A line on a map that no one looks at. A ghost in the rock beneath cities that are busy thinking about other things. There is no villain in this story, only forgetting in time. The faults are not malicious. They are not waiting to punish. They are just old. Wounds healing, mostly, until they are not. And when one of these quiet cracks finally shifts, it will not announce itself with fanfare. It will simply arrive in the early morning, or during rush hour, or in the hush of night, a tremble in the dishes, a jolt in the bedrock, a breath from the deep earth exhaled all at once. The cities built above these forgotten faults will not crumble all at once, but they may crack, pipes may burst, roads may buckle, power may flicker, and more than that, certainty will disappear, because nothing unsettles a city like discovering the ground is not still. So what should we do with the knowledge of faults without fame? Should we worry? Panic? No, but we should listen. We should build like listeners. We should live with awareness instead of amnesia. We should remember that not all dangers announce themselves in headlines. Some live quietly in the silence beneath our feet. In a world that rewards noise, fame, and visibility, these faults are reminders that the earth does not care about attention. It moves in silence. It breaks in stillness. And sometimes it chooses the least expected places to make itself known. Beneath our feet, the earth is always breathing, but so slowly. We mistake it for stillness. What we call solid ground is a slow-motion ballet of tectonic plates, pushed by forces older than memory, older than mountains, older than the idea of measurement itself. This is not chaos. This is pressure. And pressure, unspoken and unbroken, is the quietest form of time in the field of geophysics. There is a term whispered with both respect and unease: stress accumulation. It sounds technical, even dull, but what it means is the earth is saving up energy, like a muscle that tightens without release, like a breath that never exhales, like a violin string wound tighter and tighter until one day the bow doesn't even touch and it snaps. Stress begins in stone, not the soft kind that crumbles in your hand, but rock hard enough to carry continents. Beneath cities and oceans, beneath farmland and desert, the crust of the earth bends, barely. It doesn't look like it. It doesn't feel like it, but it does. Two tectonic plates collide, or slide past, or tug in opposite directions, so slowly that even a century barely registers their impatience. And over time, this resistance builds tension. It builds and builds and builds until even the most ancient stone can hold no more. Scientists call it elastic rebound theory. It sounds like something from a trampoline, but it's not playful. It means that the Earth's crust behaves like a stretched band, storing elastic energy as it bends until it reaches a threshold. And when it slips, that's the earthquake. That's the release. That's the moment stored energy becomes movement, not over days, not in chapters, but in seconds. A century of quiet tension resolved in a blink. Think of stress accumulation as the Earth's diary, but written in fault lines and forgotten layers of sediment. Each year that passes without a quake is a sentence not yet finished. Each inch of crust that resists motion is punctuation waiting for a verb. when we measure seismic gaps, when we chart the time between tremors, we're not predicting disaster. We're reading the pages of a story still unfolding below us. The numbers are there, but they whisper. A fault accumulates stress at a rate of a few millimeters per year. Maybe 5, maybe 10. Not much, not enough for the eye, not enough for urgency. But over 50 years, that's half a meter. Over 200 years, a full meter of strain. And if the rock beneath can only tolerate a meter of flex before it breaks, then it is only a matter of time. This is what makes stress accumulation so unsettling. It's not about what has happened, it's about what hasn't yet. The longer the pause, the bigger the release. The quieter the pressure, the louder the result. And yet most of us never notice, because pressure doesn't call out. It does not arrive in the news. It does not interrupt traffic. It simply waits. And it's not just geological. The metaphor runs deeper, because even we, the creatures above, live our lives under tension. Small disappointments, calmed spoken fears. The daily strain of patience held without relief. People, like planets, store stress, and we too have our fault lines. But the earth does not learn from us. It teaches. Every crack in the crust is a masterclass in long-term memory. Every delayed quake is a reminder that the world does not forget just because we do. It stores. It remembers. It prepares without showing its hand. And then it moves across the globe. Geologists watch this process in silence, not with alarms, not with sirens, but with GPS stations, laser measurements, and sensors buried deep in boreholes that capture each subtle deformation as the land beneath us shifts by millimeters. It's like watching the earth breathe one molecule at a time. It's like listening to a sleeping giant shift in its dreams. And when it finally wakes, even briefly, the results are written across landscapes. Mountains rising, rivers changing course, buildings crumbling in their foundations, as if reminded they were only ever guessed. And then it goes quiet again, but not still, never still, just winding up for another century of saving. There is a strange peace in understanding this, because it means the ground has never truly been solid, and yet we have built empires on it. We plant cities atop tension and call it stability. We trace streets over ancient fractures and forget their names. But the earth does not forget. It listens, it adjusts, and on its schedule, it exhales. Is there danger in this? Yes, but also rhythm. Also awe, because no machine could hold tension this long without breaking. No structure could bend invisibly for centuries without giving way. But the earth does it again and again. It folds its strain into valleys and ridges, kin to sediment and silence. And then it speaks with one long breath that shifts a city. What does this mean for the fault lines beneath our homes? It means that silence is not safety. It means that calm is not stillness. It means that sometimes the most urgent thing is the thing we cannot see. Stress accumulation teaches patience, but not comfort. It teaches vigilance, but not panic. It reminds us that every place, even the quiet ones, has a memory measured in pressure. And someday, that pressure may return the favor. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, in your room, in your city built on ancient stone, remember, the ground beneath you is not empty, is not passive, it is not new. It is holding a story, a long, slow story written in tension and time. And while it may seem silent, it is still speaking, just not in words you can hear yet. You don't feel it, but it's happening. Beneath Brooklyn's sidewalks, beneath the espresso machines in Manhattan cafes, beneath the waiting taxis in Queens, the earth shivers just a little. Not enough to spill a coffee, not enough to make the news, not even enough to be noticed by the pigeons or the passers-by, but it happens all the same. Small earthquakes, tiny tremors, movements so slight they pass through the world like a whisper through velvet. The scientists call them microquakes. You might call them forgotten moments, but the Earth doesn't forget. In the world of seismology, most people know about the big ones, the Richter 7 South and 8 South, the quakes that break roads and twist steel, that fill headlines and haunt memory. But for every earthquake that makes noise are thousands that don't. Microquakes are often smaller than magnitude 2.0. Many are smaller than 1.0. A 1.0 quake is so soft you'd need to be lying face down on bedrock, holding your breath just to maybe feel it, like the brush of a breeze across your chest. They happen all the time, all across the country, all across the world, and yes, even beneath the boroughs of New York. The city doesn't tremble. It listens. Underneath the subway lines, in between the water mains, beneath the polished granite of office towers and the damp cellars of old tenements, the bedrock moves and whispers. Geologists have placed seismometers across the region, in Staten Island basements, in Queens utility rooms, and even under university halls in the Bronx. These sensors are attuned to movements so delicate they can detect when a train passes, when a crowd cheers at Yankee Stadium. But beyond the human noise, beneath it, they hear something older, small pulses, tiny slips, moments where the crust tightened by decades of imperceptible stress. Let's go just a little. Sometimes the microquakes happen deep, 6 miles below the surface. Sometimes shallower, 2 miles, or even less. Their origin stories are quiet but meaningful. A fracture in the bedrock nudges, releasing tension gathered over years. Groundwater seeps into a fault, lubricating rock against rock until gravity gets its way. The earth sighs, just for a moment. No fanfare, no damage, just a tiny adjustment in the long, slow movement of geological time. To the untrained eye, microquakes seem like non-events, too small to matter, too brief to consider. But they are important. Each one is a clue, a message from the crust, a data point in the invisible map of how stress behaves beneath our feet. They help seismologists understand where faults are still active, where strain is building, and where the next significant rupture might one day begin. They are, in a way, the heartbeat of the earth, soft, steady, ongoing, in New York. Most residents believe earthquakes don't happen here. They think of the West Coast, San Francisco, of the San Andreas Fault. But the truth is more nuanced. New York sits on what geologists call a stable continental interior bedrock that is very old, generally quiet, but not silent. The area around New York City is cut by several small faults, remnants of ancient tectonic collisions and separations that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago. The Ramapo Fault, Dickman Street Fault, the Harlem Fault. These names do not appear on subway maps, but they exist. K-shift, and sometimes they speak. Most of the time, they speak in whispers. In 2001, a magnitude 2.4 quake shook part of Manhattan, felt by a few early risers, ignored by most. No damage, but the instruments noticed. In 2015, a 1.7 tremor near Yonkers, barely a flutter. Yet the data was captured, analyzed, archived. In between those minor quakes, hundreds of microquakes with no press, no panic. Just points on a graph in the quiet offices of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, where people watch the ground as it shifts beneath a city that assumes some movable microquakes matter because they tell us the faults are not fossilized, not dead, not forgotten. They are sleeping, perhaps, but not gone. And even the smallest movement proves the crust is alive with potential. The risk is low, yes. New York is not San Francisco. The faults are shorter, the activity less frequent. But less frequent doesn't mean never. There's a paradox here. On the one hand, microquakes release tension, a sort of geological sigh, letting out a bit of pressure that might otherwise build toward a larger rupture. But, on the other hand, some microquakes may be signs that pressure is rising, that the fault is shifting again, gearing up for something louder. Scientists don't yet know which is which. They watch, Atia, they measure, they model, and they wait. Just like the ground instruments today are incredibly sensitive. They can detect microquakes that shake the earth by just a few nanometers smaller than the width of a human hair. They use arrays of sensors, timing systems, precise to the millisecond. Algorithms that filter out the human hum to isolate the Earth's true voice. And from all that data, a story forms, a picture of crustal stress, of movement, of readiness, and of risk. If you were to walk over a fault line in the Bronx tonight, you wouldn't notice a thing. No markings, no signs, no rumble, just the same old sidewalk, the same old street lamp, but meters below, a crack in the rock might be shifting. Micrometers, maybe nothing, maybe everything. And it reminds us, not all silence is safety. Sometimes it is simply an unread message. Microquakes are not something to fear. They are not danger, okay? They are data. They do not break buildings, okay? They build understanding. And in a world where so much feels uncertain, okay? There is comfort in knowing that we can measure even the smallest movements, that we are listening to the slow conversations of stone, that beneath the burrows, beneath the bustle, beneath the hum of life, the earth is talking, softly, but not secretly. You walk through a city that doesn't remember what the earth once said. The bricks are neat, scaffolding new, the traffic thick with impatient breath, but the ground still listens, and it remembers everything you've chosen to forget. Forgetting feels like progress. We pave over pain. We smooth over chaos, turn the site of an earthquake into a parking lot, a bookstore, a brunch cafe, and with each layer of paint, each square of linoleum, the story gets quieter until no one mentions that the street once cracked on a still spring morning as the ground shifted under their tea. Memory lives where it's nourished, in seismographs, yes, in records, sometimes, but mostly it lives in stories, and stories are fragile things. When the people who remember die, when the children grow up in safety, when the newspapers crumble in archives, memory withers, and the danger of forgetting is not just ignorance, it's unpreparedness. The earthquake of 1884 shook more than houses. It shook assumptions. Back then, they said the East Coast didn't quake, that such things belonged to faraway faults. Then, chimneys collapsed. Church bells rang off rhythm, and New Yorkers looked up from their routines too. Ask, what if we're not so stable after all? But time passed, and the story faded because it didn't repeat. That's the cruelty of seismic time. Century might feel long to you, but to the earth, it's just a nap. If a fault last slipped in 1783, you might think it's healed, but maybe it's just waiting, storing tension like a coiled spring beneath concrete and memory foam. So when the shaking stops, humans stop talking, and that silence grows deep, so deep that even the planners forget to plan. Ask the average New Yorker about earthquake drills. They'll tell you about fire escapes, about snow days, maybe even hurricanes. But earthquakes, that's someone else's problem. A West Coast myth, not part of this city's identity. Except the earth doesn't care about identity. It only cares about pressure, time, and silence. Some city records include emergency plans. Some agencies know where the faults run. Some old engineers still draw red lines on blueprints where bedrock thins. But none of this is common. It's a conversation, because humans are wired to move on, to file fear away once the threat feels old. But the danger of the earth is that it moves slow and speaks seldom. And when it does speak, you may not have a plan ready to listen. Look around. How many buildings do you think are earthquake retrofitted? How many gas lines are built to flex rather than snap? How many stairwells will hold when the shaking lasts longer than 10 seconds? These are not questions people ask over coffee because they assume they'll never need to. But those assumptions are made of dust, just like the buildings that forget what stone can do. In cities like Tokyo or Los Angeles, earthquakes are cultural. There are drills in schools, bags near doors, reinforcements built into every beam. They know it's not if, but when. But in places like New York, the narrative is, we don't get those here. And that is how vulnerability grows, not in chaos, but in comfort. Every time we build, without remembering, we write a future that might crack. Every time we zone new neighborhoods without considering fault lines. Every time we renovate a basement without studying soil type. Every time we install elevators with no quake protocol, we assume the ground is a constant. But the ground is not a constant. It is a sleeping variable, and when it stirs, we have to answer for our forgetting. Memory doesn't have to be fear. It can be resilience. It can be thoughtful foundations, careful codes, quiet drills, practiced not out of panic, but preparedness. It could be a culture where safety is whispered, even when the earth isn't, but only if we remember that risk exists. Only if we remind ourselves that silence is not safety, that stillness is not surrender, that a century without shaking is not proof of peace. There are sensors now, smart seismometers, cloud systems, early warning networks in other parts of the world. But here, on the East Coast, we still live by the myth of permanence. We still believe that because something hasn't happened, it won't. And so we spend billions on things that move subways, bridges, trains, but not enough on what might move beneath them. It's not about paranoia. It's about responsibility. Just as we build to survive fires, we can build to respect the ground. It's not glamorous. No. Politician wins elections by funding seismic retrofits. No. Headline celebrates an earthquake that didn't happen, but would have caused less damage if it did. Preparedness is invisible, but so is the fault, and so is regret. The earth has no memory the way we do. It doesn't feel guilt or loss or nostalgia. It only remembers force. And when enough builds up, it lets go. And when that moment comes, you'll hope someone, somewhere, chose not to forget. If we forget that the earth can move, we forget how to stand. And one day, when the sidewalk shifts beneath your shoes, you'll wish we had talked about this sooner. A bridge stands like a promise, quiet strength above water, above road, above time. Steel bones, stone arches, rivet by rivet, built to last. But every promise is only as good as the ground that holds it. And in New York, the ground does not always promise to stay still. You see the skyline and think it's permanence. You see the bridges and think it's invincible. You walk past buildings older than your grandparents and trust they'll outlive your grandchildren. But what you don't see is the tension beneath the pause in the rock, the whisper of pressure in the crust, the memory of movement that hasn't yet returned. Most of New York was not built for shaking. It was built for snow, for wind, for the long, slow wait of seasons, not the sudden jolt of an earth rebelling from beneath. So, the bridges span with Grace, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Williamsburg, symbols of reach and ingenuity, but they are only as strong as the soil at their feet. And some of that soil is fill, dredged, dumped, packed, a mixture of history and haste. What happens when solid ground becomes suggestion? What happens when the tremor touches the places built on centuries of assumption? Retrofitting a bridge costs more than many cities wish to spend, and yet not retrofitting may cost even more, but in silence, in grief, in hours after a quake, when answers come too late. It's not just bridges, it's hospitals that must not fail when the ground begins to hum. Its schools where desks are too fragile to shelter beneath. Its water mains that crack not from age, but from shift. Its buildings that sway not because they're built to, but because they weren't built not to. Seismic blind spots aren't gaps in vision. They're gaps in expectation. They form when builders assume the worst won't happen, when blueprints skip the line about lateral movement, when budgets remove the extra steel because the odds are low, because it hasn't happened yet, because it probably won't, because we have other problems. And so we build with hope instead of knowledge, and hope has no sheer resistance. In 2011, a rare 5.8 magnitude quake shook the East Coast. Its epicenter was in Virginia, but New York felt it, not deeply, not destructively, but just enough to remind the city that the ground is not a given. Buildings emptied. People stood outside, confused, not terrified, just unprepared. It passed. No one died, okay? And so the story quieted again, but the tremor remains on record, okay? As does the lesson we chose not to learn. Tall buildings move, even without earthquakes. They flex in the wind. They're designed for it, but many older buildings, the ones that feel solid, stoic, aren't built with movement in mind. Brick and mortar are brittle lovers. They don't dance well, crack, they crumble, and yet they line our streets side by side. History above delis, offices above bakeries, homes above bars, stacked stories on stillness, until stillness fails. Underground, the risk spreads. Subways snake beneath the boroughs, tunnels loop under rivers. But few think of what happens when an ancient fault remembers how to speak. The rails might buckle, the walls might shift, and the systems that run the city might suddenly not run at all. Even our most resilient buildings aren't immune. Skyscrapers may withstand sway, but they depend on elevators, on power, on access. If the base shakes, if the lines break, if the structure tilts just enough to close doors, to crack seals, then the height becomes hazard. A tower becomes a trap. What's the solution? It's not panic. It's design. It's remembering the earth when you draw the blueprints. It's budgeting for what might never happen, because that's the cost of care. It's training workers to know where the weak points are. It's adding flexible joints, 2 water lines, 2 gas mains. It's building, not just for today, but for the tremor that may wait a century to arrive. Some cities have started. Boston has begun to study its seismic risk. Philadelphia keeps quiet, but watches. New York. It listens occasionally, then returns to the hum of taxis and footsteps and steel, because the quake isn't loud enough yet. There are quiet efforts, inspectors who note cracks with a wrong angle, engineers who recommend more steel than requested, scientists who whisper at city meetings about a need for resilience. But in a city that moves fast, slow danger gets buried, not out of malice, it's just momentum. So the blind spots remain in corners of schools, basements of apartment buildings, in the joints of bridges that no one has tested in decades. They sleep. Like the fault, they wait. Like pressure, they rest beneath the illusion that we are ready, just because we've never needed to be. There's beauty in what we've built. The skyline gleams, the bridges stretch, the buildings rise with pride. But beauty can break, and strength can fracture, unless we choose to look down as well as up, unless we trace the maps beneath our feet as carefully as we trace the roads ahead. Preparedness is a quiet virtue. It doesn't shout, it doesn't shine, but it holds, like a foundation that doesn't shift, like a pillar that doesn't crack, like a bridge that bends instead of breaking. The city's greatest blind spot is not its bridges, or buildings, or blueprints. It's belief, the belief that the earth will stay polite, that the past predicts the next second. That silence means safety, but the earth does not promise comfort, only change. And when that change comes, the question won't be how strong we built. It will be how clearly we saw what could fall, and how willing we were to build for it before it did. It starts with a folder, thick paper, edges worn from time, a tab labeled quietly, Earthquake Preparedness. Few open it. Even fewer believe they'll ever need it. Because here, the city of rising rents and subway delays, an earthquake doesn't feel like a real threat. It feels distant, a West Coast problem, a tremor too far away to matter. But the earth doesn't recognize regions. It doesn't remember boundaries, only pressure. And pressure builds, no matter where the people believe in it or not. The city has plans. Of course it does. Every agency keeps a stack of contingencies. Emergency management has protocols. Fire departments have drills. Hospitals have backup generators, at least on paper. But how do you prepare a city that's forgotten the possibility, where earthquake insurance is rare, where buildings weren't designed to sway, where elevators don't automatically stop at the next floor when the ground trembles, where parents don't teach their children what to do when the bookshelves fall? A plan is only as useful as the moment it reaches someone's hands. And most plans live in filing cabinets, or in PDFs scanned once, filed away. But when a quake comes, it doesn't email first. It doesn't wait for meetings. It doesn't care whether you're logged in. It arrives in silence or in sound, in a moment or in a minute. And what matters then is not the plan on paper, but the instinct it planted beforehand. Imagine it now. A Tuesday morning, it's before 9, coffee shops full, schools humming, subways packed, and then a low groan like the city exhaling from beneath. A pause in the hum, flicker in the lights, then the lurch. Not violent, perhaps, but just enough for tables to rattle, for windows to moan in their frames, for the street to feel unsure. And what happens next is not about the quake, but about how ready the people are to act. Do they know to duck, to cover, to wait? Do they rush for doorways that won't protect them? Do they flee buildings that might hold just fine? Do they call 911, jamming lines meant for those already trapped? Does anyone remember where the gas shutoff valve is, or that elevators are not safe, that stairwells can be fragile, that a bridge of one that didn't fall needs inspection before traffic returns? Preparedness is not about predicting disaster. It's about shaping response before disaster decides to arrive. And response begins with belief. If people don't think it can happen, they won't prepare. If they've never felt the earth move beneath them, they assume it never will. If their apartment lease says nothing about seismic safety, they won't ask. And when the quiet plan meets loud reality, it may not hold. The city has sirens. They're tested now and then, usually for hurricanes or in the shadow of another kind of threat. But earthquakes come without warning. By the time the siren sounds, the moment has passed. That's why the most important plan is the one that lives in memory, not in documents. The habit, the drill, the muscle memory of resilience. In Tokyo, children practice. They crouch beneath desks. They cover their heads. They wait as sirens howl in rehearsed patterns. And then they stand again, sloughing nervously, knowing they've done this before. In San Francisco, buildings sway with the wind. It's engineered not just for comfort, but for survival. The city breathes with the knowledge that the ground may one day shift. But New York assumes the subway will run, that traffic lights will blink in order, that bricks will stay where they've been since 1912, because they always have, until they don't. Emergency planning isn't glamorous. There's no ribbon cutting, no viral video of a successful fire drill, and so funding is sparse. Attention wanders. The budget favors problems that already scream. But the quiet ones, they wait in the margins, and they grow. There are communities that remember. Haitian New Yorkers who felt Port-au-Prince fall. Armenian. Families who speak of SPITAK. Turkish immigrants who remember Izmit for them. The plan is more than paper. It is survival, passed from parent to child, spoken in kitchens, practiced at school gates, and yet the broader city forgets again and again, because forgetting is easier than preparing for something you've never seen. A truly prepared city does more than react. It updates building codes, not just for cost, but for consequence. It trains bus drivers not just to drive, but to protect. During chaos, it funds community centers, not just for shelter, but for education. It treats earthquakes not as impossibilities, but as inevitabilities with uncertain timing. What would it look like if the city believed? If every tenant knew how to brace a bookcase? If every school ran a drill, not just for fire, but for tremors? If neighborhoods had local response teams, not just for crime, but for collapse? The subway had posted maps, not just for stops, but for emergency exits in case of Joaquin-induced derailment. What if belief was the beginning of safety? New York is a city of preparedness when it chooses to be. It faced hurricanes. It rebuilt after fires. It mourned towers and rose again. But the next threat may not be so visible. It may come from the very ground it trusts, and the only way to meet. Hey, it is with readiness so quiet it becomes a habit. That readiness must start now, not with fear, but with awareness. Not with panic, but with practice. It's in the way we build, the way we teach, the way we remember that the earth, like time, doesn't stop just because we ignore it. So when you next walk the sidewalk, past buildings older than your memories, ask yourself, is this place prepared? And am I? Because the earth does not call ahead, but it always answers eventually. And the cities that listen early are the ones that stand after the silence. It begins as a whisper, not in the street, not in the crowd, but somewhere quiet. In a room filled with maps, charts, and numbers that don't speak aloud. A geologist runs a finger along a line. It curves like an old scar across the crust beneath. The northeast, she stops near the Hudson, a frown. Then silence. The earth, she knows, doesn't need to roar. It just needs to shift once, to remind us it still breathes. And so the question presses against the edge of sleep. Could it happen? Again, in science, we don't ask if, we ask when. We ask how often. We ask how bad. But the public prefers certainty. A yes or a no. A promise that the ground is loyal and the buildings will always stand. But the earth is not a politician. It doesn't campaign. It doesn't make vows. It simply moves when the stress exceeds the silence. So, could it happen again? Yes, in fact, it already has. Though most have forgotten. Let's return to 1884. It was a warm August evening. New York was bustling. As always, horse-drawn trolleys clipping over cobblestones. Market vendors calling from curbside stalls. Women in bustled skirts fanning themselves beneath gaslight. And then, the shake. It lasted only seconds, but the city paused. Chandeliers swung. Bricks tumbled from facades in Brooklyn. Windows cracked in Harlem. Candy, below, in the granite that nobody noticed. Something old and unsettled flexed. They called it the New York earthquake. The newspapers laughed it off. No lives lost, only inconvenience. But those who listen to Stone, they remember, and they know that it was not the first, nor the last. Before 1884, there were others. In 1737, quake shook the city so fiercely that clocks stopped. Church bells rang with no hands upon them, and walls, for a moment, forgot how to be still. Even earlier, the Lenape spoke of the land rumbling in the night. They didn't have Richter scales. They didn't mark tremors in columns. But they remembered. They told stories of nights when the rivers stirred and the rocks beneath the forest trails vibrated with breath. The science is careful. We know that the eastern United States sits atop old fault zones. Ancient, yes, but not extinct. Unlike the West Coast, where tectonic plates actively grind, the East is quieter, more composed, but still full of tension. The crust is thicker here, denser. It carries stress farther, which means when it finally lets go, even just a little, the effects spread wide. A quake in Virginia once rang church bells in Boston. A small shift in Canada rattled dinner plates in Connecticut. Distance does not promise safety. Age does not promise stillness. New York's bedrock, the Manhattan schist, is strong. That's why the skyline climbs. Steel sits comfortably on stone that has withstood eons of weight. But even stone has its seams. Even ancient rock remembers. Old collisions from the time when continents danced and oceans opened like breath. Those old faults, though buried, are not gone. They rest, okay? But they do not forget. Seismologists monitor tiny sensors lie tucked beneath the soil. On rooftops, in subway tunnels, they measure vibration. They chart ground motion. They track stress patterns that are invisible to the eye, but not to the instrument. And the data whispers. Yes, movement still stirs beneath. Microquakes, gentle rumbles, small adjustments in the crust, too faint for your bones to feel, but enough to remind the watchers that the earth is still composing its next note. Probability models exist. They calculate chance over decades, centuries. They speak in percentages. A 5% chance in the next 50 years. A 15% chance by the end of the century, too. Most those numbers feel small. It's easy to ignore. Not worth rearranging your life for, but risk doesn't need to be certain to matter. It only needs to arrive once, and when it does, statistics become hindsight. Could it happen again? Yes, but not necessarily like before. It might not come with the clang of dropped bricks. It may arrive more subtly. A subway that stops mid-tunnel, a sudden, sharp crack across an old wall. Elevators that refuse to close, and then the realization that the floor is not where it was a second ago. No fire, no smoke, just stillness interrupted by something more ancient than any skyline. And here is the quiet truth. New York is not ready, not fully, not deeply, because belief is a prerequisite for preparation, and belief here is scarce. Ask 10 people on the street if they've ever thought about an earthquake, and you may hear laughter. Isn't that a California thing? They'll ask with a shrug. But the fault line doesn't care where your accent comes from. It only cares that pressure is pressure, and that all things have limits. Infrastructure ages, pipes crack, bridges flex with the weight of time. Buildings, especially the oldest ones, made before seismic codes were a conversation. They stand proud, but vulnerable. Brownstones don't sway. They crumble. Skyscrapers built before seismic retrofitting. They resist, but not forever. And glass, as always, shatters before it bends. Preparedness is possible. Some cities invest, retrofit schools, strengthen bridges, teach children not just to memorize fire exits, but to find safe spaces when the earth moves. New York could do the same. It has the resources, it's the knowledge, the engineers. What it lacks is urgency. See, urgency often requires a tremor to awaken. But that's a dangerous exchange, because the first quake may not be a gentle reminder. Could it happen again? Yes, and if it does, the city will listen differently. In the days that follow, people will speak of preparedness, articles will appear, budgets will shift, and for a while, memory will feel fresh. But memory fades, and unless it is carved into action, into concrete, steel, and curriculum, it vanishes, just like the tremor that sparked it. So tonight, as you lie in your apartment, above the stone, beneath the sky, know that the ground remembers more than you do. Not in fear, but in fact, it remembers being pushed, folded, pressed by time. It remembers the collisions that formed this continent, the drift, the crush, the silence afterward. And it waits, not with malice, not with threat, just with gravity and history, in the patience of stone. There's a soft comfort in numbers, in probabilities, charts, in colored maps, in lines that arc like promises, rising here, dipping there. A pattern meant to soothe. Engineers point to zones. Scientists offer graphs. Models are built, tested, revised, then trusted. And trust becomes routine. But the Earth never signed off on any model. It never approved the equations or nodded politely at the simulations. It doesn't know what we expect. It only knows its own deep memory of force and fault and fold. And sometimes that memory surprises us. Earthquake models are not magic. They're not oracles or seers. They're stories told with data, trained on the past, hoping to guess the future. But what if the past itself is incomplete? What if the archives are missing a page? Begin with the basics. To make a model, you need records. When did earthquakes happen? Where? How strong were they? And so we look to seismographs, delicate instruments that record ground motion as inked lines, a shiver made visible. But seismographs have only existed for just over a century. A blink, the Earth, in contrast, measures its own history in millions of years. So models try to build a future on a fraction of a whisper. It's like guessing the plot of a novel after reading only a few scattered words. Some earthquakes happened long before we had instruments. They left traces in old buildings, in broken layers of soil, in accounts scribbled by candlelight. But even those stories are vague. Was the shaking caused by an earthquake, or a thunderous wagon on wooden streets? Was a church wall cracked by tectonic stress, or by the settling of damp foundation stone? Uncertainty grows, okay? And uncertainty never fits neatly into an algorithm. Then there's the question of what we don't know. Hidden faults, deep, buried lines in the rock, so old, so quiet, that no one alive has ever seen them move. But they are there, somewhere beneath basements, beneath parks, beneath grocery store parking lots and subway stations. The Earth still keeps its secrets, and models can only model what they've seen. They can't predict what they've never imagined. Even when we feed them the best data, models make assumptions. They simplify because reality, the true complexity of crust and pressure and temperature and time is too vast to capture. So we say, all earthquakes of this type behave like this. We expect this level of motion at this distance. We believe the risk is low. And most of the time, we are right until the moment we are not. In 2011, Japan learned this the hard way. Their models said the maximum earthquake expected along a particular stretch of coastline was magnitude 8.0. Their seawalls were built for that. Their emergency drills, their nuclear plant protocols, all aligned with that number. But the quake that arrived was a 9.1, 1,000 times stronger than they'd planned for. The tsunami washed over walls, okay? The models didn't fail. They simply hadn't known that such a rupture was possible. And that is the lesson. The Earth is under no obligation to behave like last time. New York is far from the Pacific. It does not sit on the edge of tectonic plates. It doesn't feel tremors weakly or rumble with aftershocks like cities in Chile or Indonesia. But that doesn't mean its faults are absent. It only means they're silent more often. Silence, as we've seen, is not the same as safety. Imagine a fault buried beneath Queens. It hasn't moved in 500 years. No one's alive who remembers. No written records remain. Seismologists never mark it. Engineers never design for it. Developers build upon it. And then, one afternoon, after centuries of stillness, it shifts. The ground doesn't explode. It contracts. A long, slow push, and then a snap in one breath. Subway lines halt. Water mains crack. Traffic lights flicker, and freeze. Not because the models were wrong, but because they didn't know. Models also miss how people behave. They predict shaking, they estimate damage, but they can't tell you what a crowd will do when the ground moves beneath them. They don't know how fear travels, how someone stuck in an elevator might panic and hurt themselves, how parents may run for children, ignoring falling glass, how drivers might speed into intersections just to escape the feeling of motion. The earthquake ends in seconds, but consequences, they linger far beyond the waveform. And then there's recovery. Models estimate economic impact. They chart days to restore power. They calculate damage to structures, but they cannot measure grief. They do not understand what it feels like to lose the walls you grew up in, to see the diner you ate in every Sunday now buried in dust. They can't feel the weight of standing outside your apartment, your keys in your hand, but nothing left behind the door. They don't know that a city is more than steel and concrete. It's memory, it's rhythm, it's what people make together. And when the ground erases that even for a moment, no algorithm can tell you how long the spirit will take to return. Still, models matter. They are not lies. They are guides, maps in the dark. They help us prepare, plan, build smarter, respond faster. But they are not prophecy. They are not omniscient. They do not know the next crack until it appears. So what do we do with this knowledge? Do we ignore the models because they are imperfect? No, we use them, but humbly. We read them, but not as gospel. We plan for more than just the likely. We admit what we do not know, because it is in the space of not knowing that true resilience begins, not just in steel reinforcements or deeper foundations, but in minds that understand that even the quietest earth can change its mind at night. As the city lies in sleep, the sensors beneath it keep listening to footsteps, to trains, to the whisper of shifting rock, and once in a while, sketch a tremble that no one else hears, a soft exhale from stone itself. They record it, archive it, feed it into the next model, and the model grows slightly wiser, but never complete, never certain, because the earth does not repeat itself. It only rhymes in unexpected verses in unscheduled time. Imagine a city not as noise, but as tension held in perfect balance, like a violin string pulled tight, resonating softly with the hum of motion. Trains, elevators, voices, wind, all playing above the silent chord beneath. And beneath it, always, stone dot silent, until it is in single quotes, New York balances on rock older than memory. Beneath the subways, beneath the foundations and footings of skyscrapers, lies the Manhattan schist, a metamorphic bed formed over 450 million years ago, folded and compressed when ancient continents collided. It is strong, dense, reliable. Builders love it. Architects trust it. But strength does not mean stillness. Hand reliability is not the same as immunity. Even the hardest stone is part of a deeper equation, a system of balance and strain, of pressure redistributed over centuries, of ancient faults that wait like lines in a forgotten play. No one remembers when the first act began, but the final act may come without an announcement. Silence is easy to overlook in a city like this. There is the silence beneath Grand Central, a cavernous hush where dust floats in slanted beams of light, and footfalls echo like distant drums. There is the silence of elevator shafts at night, dark wells that hum with expectation. There is the silence beneath the Hudson, where tunnels curl through clay and silt. The sound of rushing water is held back by steel and will, but most silent of all is the rock immovable, unseen, trusted until it shifts. The city was built upward because it could rest on something firm. That's the story everyone knows. The schist allowed steel allowed skyline. But the unspoken truth is this: we never asked what the stone remembered. We assumed that stillness meant consent. No one spoke to the rock. They just drilled into it, anchored beams, dug foundations, laid tunnels, and assumed it would hold. It has, so far. But the weight accumulates. Not just the weight of buildings, but the weight of years, of stress, of pressure shifting under tectonic silence. Balance can last a long time, but not forever. In Central Park, tourists snap photos beside exposed ridges of bedrock, gray and grooved, as if a giant had scratched his fingernails across the city. They call it pretty, ancient, interesting. Few of them know they are standing on a fault line. A hidden crack runs beneath the park, a remnant of old tectonic wounds. It has not moved in lifetimes, but it exists, and the earth does not always ask for permission before rewriting its own past. Silence in this city is a performance. People carve out quiet hours between alarms and meetings, between deadlines and deadlines, but the silence under the streets is not scheduled. It is geological. It stretches back to before humans, before language, before even the Appalachian Mountains rose, and it continues beneath the concrete while we sleep, while we build, while we forget. In an office tower, someone sips coffee and checks their calendar in a school. A teacher erases yesterday's lesson and starts again. In a hospital, an elevator hums its slow ascent, and beneath all of them, the rock listens. It does not judge. It does not threaten. It merely absorbs tiny shifts, minuscule pressures, like sand piling slowly on a scale, until one day the balance tips. Earthquakes don't begin with a roar. They begin with a breath. A fraction of a second when locked rock lets go. The energy doesn't travel fast at first. It curls outward like a ripple in fabric, soft, then sharper, then real. Windows vibrate before they shatter. Lights flicker before they fall. And silence, suddenly, is replaced by the memory of motion. A city balanced on silence does not fall all at once. It leans, it buckles, it questions itself. Subway lines pause. Phones lose signal. People freeze, not because they know what's happening, but because something primal tells them that the ground is no longer trustworthy. For a moment, there is no sound but the groan of structure and the whisper of realization. Then the city exhales, not relief, just movement. Even if the quake is mild, even if the damage is cosmetic. Something changes. The silence afterward is heavier, more awake. People look differently at bridges, at old buildings, at the cracks in the corner of the ceiling. They ask, was that always there? They wonder, what else lies beneath that we forgot to notice? And the models update sensors, record the tremor. Scientists input new data. Maps get shaded differently. But the city returns to routine until next time, because silence is seductive. It promises stability. It whispers, nothing will change. But it is a fragile contract. The earth does not need your permission to shift beneath your plans. It only needs time, and time is something the ground has never lacked. Look at the skyline from across the river. See how it gleams, how each building stands like a statement, unmoving, proud, precise. Now imagine all of that resting on a whisper that may, someday, grow tired of being still. This is not cause for panic. It is cause for reverence, for noticing, for remembering that stillness is earned, not guaranteed, for designing with humility, building with foresight, living with respect for the rock that holds us up. Some cities dance with their faults. They expect the earth to move. New York pretends. It never will, but pretending is not prevention, and silence is not security. A city balanced on silence must learn to listen before the whisper becomes a shift. As night falls over the grid of lights, and the hum of life softens into sleep, beneath the blankets of the Upper West Side, beneath the sidewalks of Midtown, beneath the subways, paused and quiet, beneath the deepest bedrock of the island's silence, waits, not to strike, not to punish, only to remind that even the ground we take for granted has a voice, and though it speaks rarely, when it does, we will all remember what it means to listen, listen.